John Vinchgard's book, The Ordination of Women in the Catholic Church. And Camille, he has a chapter there on Mary. And Mary, Mother of God, was a woman priest. I threw the book up in the air. Then I had to regather it. Wait a minute. Did I really read what I read? And I was really excited until the point where the realization came in that my church had lied to me.
I'm so happy to meet you. Welcome to the show.
Oh, Camille, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
This is just so wonderful. We have a friend in common. We were just talking about this, Father Ann, who I found her work as I was just kind of reading some, Christianity blogs that I still do. And I came upon her work and I was like blown away at this idea of Roman Catholic women priests. So, of course, I interviewed her on the show and then you and I connected and now we get to continue the conversation.
Yes, and it's definitely, certainly a needed conversation.
Yeah.
Because, here we are in 2024.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's been a hidden secret, what
Yeah.
we'll get into today.
Yeah.
And, there's nonsense doesn't even cover it.
Well, it's funny that I got a chance to read your book, and your book is Scandal in the Shadows, the original priest, Mary Mother. I got a chance to read your book, and there was this one quote I wanted to bring up that I absolutely loved that I think will help us kind of kick things off. This is in chapter 3. You said, if someone had told me back in the 1950s or 1960s that someday I would be picketing on behalf of women priests, I would definitely have thought that person had lost it. Not being aware then of this actual history of women in our church, I would have laughed to myself about such a propitious thought. Much like today, when I picket, fellow Catholics probably view me as the one having lost it as well. For many, this is their first encounter in hearing about this lost church history. And just like I was saying before, until I stumbled upon Father Ann's work, this was my first time hearing about this. I went to a Catholic university, even though I didn't grow up Catholic. I did go to a Catholic university, so I knew a little bit about Catholic church history, but clearly not as much as I could. Not that. So with that, I would love to just start with your upbringing, because from what you said in the book, it sounds like it was a fairly typical Catholic upbringing.
Yes, I grew up as a young girl in the early 50s, and I came from an Irish Catholic family, and our faith was very important to us. Yeah. But I had some early experiences that really were very indelible for me as far as differences between like what a girl can do, what a boy could do. Mm-hmm. And my mother, as a birthday gift, brought my brother Paul a cardboard replica of a church altar. So, of course, Paul begins to be the priest.
Yeah.
And then we were told, myself, my twin sister Pat, grabbed some chairs. We sat down in front of this altar. We were the parishioners. So everything was going fine to a certain point where I stood up and I said, no, Paul, I want to be a priest. And what he said really shocked me because I had, wasn't aware of that. I was still a young girl.
Yeah.
And he said, no, you're girls. You have to be a man to be a priest. Mm-hmm. So that really hit me. And then sometime later, my mom was an organist. Yeah. And it was like a weekly thing where once a week the choir would practice and they were finished. And my mom says, would you girls like to go down and stand behind the altar? Mm. Well, you have to remember in the 50s, women were not allowed on the altar. So this was like huge, we had played at home when my brother Paul stopped being the priest. My
Yeah.
sister and myself, we would rotate, we stood behind this replica, but now we're gonna be in an actual church
Yeah.
standing behind that altar.
Yeah.
And my, twin Pat had her chance, and then it was my turn, and I was, sort of, like, situating myself to center myself, and
Huh.
I don't know why I had this crazy thought. I looked out, and I thought, "This has to be neat on the weekends," because back in the '50s, the church pews were packed,
Yeah.
with people.
Yeah.
So then, all of a sudden, there was this awful gruff voice. "What are those girls
Ugh.
doing up on the altar?"
Mhm.
And then I got nervous because that Monsignor was my mother's boss.
Right. Yeah.
And it just even hit me, his whole tone,
Mm.
the whole inflection of it,
Yeah.
was a real put down. And then
Mm.
my mother said back to him, "You're right, Father. They
Mm.
can't be on the altar unless women are cleaning."
Ugh.
So he got beet red, and
Yeah.
thank God he left the church. So then I just stood there, another minute or two, but
Yeah.
it was such a neat experience, and it was ruined
Yeah.
by him coming in. But my mother wasn't one to rock the boat, but she was really obviously ticked off. Who
Yeah.
was this priest
Mhm.
to talk in such a way to her daughters?
Mhm. Mhm. So it sounds like there was a seed planted at a few moments in your childhood about this kind of unfairness, this imbalance of why can't girls do the same things in the church as boys, which I feel like is a fairly, I mean, it's a radical idea now, but it was definitely a radical idea then.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
That would just be, and again, for the actual laity, the parishioners out there, who were we? Did
Yeah.
we have a doctorate in theology?
Right.
You just unfortunately knew
Mhm.
you would never question
Yeah.
the a priest, let alone your monsignor.
Yeah.
You basically knew um where you should stay in your
Mhm.
pew and keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. Yeah,
Now,
there's
isn't that
this.
sad?
Well, there's it's almost like this obedience, you're just expected to be quietly obedient and not have questions. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yes, and, it wasn't until years later I had a wonderful, pastor, and, Father Bill said, "It's wonderful when people are asking questions because that's how you learn."
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
said, "I think that's the truest thing of that you can be, to your faith if you
Mhm.
start questioning it."
Yeah.
And just that idea was so refreshing. I mean, it
Mhm.
was like
Yeah. Yeah, I believe in the questions, and that kind of takes me to the next point. In your book, you note, as I kind of alluded to in that quote, that women were ordained for the first 1200 years of church history, which is a fairly long time. How did you first discover that? Did it come from asking questions? How did you find that out?
Oh, I was reading, it wasn't until I started finding books that dealt specifically with biblical research.
Yeah.
Because so many times on the picket line, well, where is this in the Bible?
Right.
And I will say, well, no, it's not in the Bible. It's biblical research.
Yeah.
And the quote that you were referring to for the first 1200 years of Christianity,
Yeah.
women were ordained, it came from Gary Macy's book, The Hidden History of Women
Mhm.
in the Church. And he even said when he made that quote that when he read it the first time, he was like almost in so many words blown away
Yeah.
because he had
Really.
never heard that or let alone seen that.
Yeah. Yeah, that I was blown away by that too, as I was reading your book, and you do this great job of bringing these facts up over and over to kind of almost gently let the reader let it sink in, because it is a bit of a shock.
Yes.
The thing that I'm still trying to understand is, and maybe we don't know the full story of this, what stopped the ordination of women? I mean, you have this history, this rich history of 1,200 years, and we'll get into some of that evidence, but do you have an idea of why the church stopped ordaining women after 1,200 years?
You have to go way back into the earliest centuries. That's
Yeah.
where this information through biblical research was found. And
Mhm.
isn't it ironic? This is the same period of time that the church hierarchy never recognizes this period of history.
Mm.
So just looking at that, you have a period of history there that your own church never recognizes.
Yeah.
So obviously, if they don't recognize it, it's in a sense buried. And
Mhm.
what happens in the Catholic Church is if they make like a decision or whatever, and in this case, woman eventually, couldn't become ordained, well, then the scribes that are writing, they don't have to ever mention then that fact
Mm.
that women were, ordained, women were in
Sure.
these positions. So then it does, in a sense, become a hidden history.
Mhm.
But the popes and, down through the centuries, they know that history's there
Yeah.
within their church. And that's what even makes it more hurtful when it's just one Catholic out of billions.
Mhm.
I was reading John Vinchgard's book, The Ordination of Women in the Catholic Church. And Camille, he has a chapter there on Mary.
Mhm.
And Mary, Mother of God, was a woman priest.
Yeah.
I threw the book up in the air. Then I had to regather it. Wait a minute. Did I really read what I read?
Yeah.
And I was really excited until the point where the realization came in that my church had lied to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
They had betrayed my trust. And there was a period there, it was really hard to, you know, try to understand how could they ever do that. But then I realized, of course, I have got to get out of this funk.
Yeah.
And then that's when I started having thoughts. Well, wait a minute. What about all the women that weren't as lucky as I was, to be reading this research? So
Mhm.
that's initially gave me the impetus to like write a book.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then even then, it was just so unreal because I don't have a doctorate in theology.
Mhm.
I have a master's in pastoral ministry, but I mean, there's a really wide variance there.
Yeah.
So, and for the most part, I'm just a regular, everyday Catholic.
Yeah.
And at some point in the book, it came to me, oh my God. I mean, the Catholic Church is just like a huge conglomerate. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
awful to say, but
Yeah.
um, the power that they have. So it was at that point I realized, wait a minute, I'm, writing this book, but I have biblical research. So
Yeah.
in a sense, I have the truth behind me.
Yes. Yes.
So then that really helped me move forward. But getting back to about why women were removed,
Mhm.
you have to go back again into the early centuries of the church. And it's all started there with the church fathers had such twisted views
Mhm.
of woman.
Mhm.
For the most part, in those early centuries, unless women had money, they were nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
The church, well, not only the church, but the average man, everyone was under this view that women were not made in the image of God.
Yeah.
They were sinners
Mhm.
because we carried the sin of Eve. Adam was there, but somehow,
Yeah.
no, it was
It's
all
just our
Eve.
fault, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just all Eve. So, okay, we are sinners.
Mhm.
We don't have the right gender. We're not made in the image of God.
Mm.
And then these men as well had just the revulsion about blood. They even
Mm.
said in so many words, like it was so abhorrent that
Mhm.
Jesus had to come out the birth canal
Mhm.
covered with blood.
Mhm.
So then we relate that to a woman and her monthly cycle.
Right.
So they're using, in a sense, all these particulars as like ammunition that women shouldn't ever be up on the altar. So
Wow.
again, this started back in the early centuries. And then you have to move up into the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And there now you have theologians, you have canon lawyers. And what happened was there was this one a man, I think he was called Ambrosius, and he started questioning, gee, were women ever ordained to begin with? And yet the Council of Chalcedon was saying, yes, they were.
Mm-hmm.
And the same man, Gary Macy, The Hidden History of Women in the Church, he said that, in fact, he had a whole chapter to it. There were rites, rites, for men. There were
Mm-hmm.
canonical requirements for men's ordination.
Yeah.
Then he said there are rites for women's ordination. There
Yeah.
were canonical requirements for women's
Yeah.
ordination. So he said they were, in fact, as much ordained as any male priest, bishop, because they were going through the same procedures as what
Yeah.
the males were at that time in early history.
Sure.
So then again, it was more of a continuation that women were never ordained.
Yeah.
So it sort of ends the question if women were never ordained,
Yeah.
well, then they can't be priests. And in
Right.
fact, they never were priests.
Yeah.
And the one canon lawyer was even questioning in St. Paul
Yeah.
that even though he named Phoebe a bishop and he named other women in religious positions, that really wasn't his intention. But then he wasn't explicit about how he knew it wasn't his intention.
Yeah.
So I mean, it just gets it's total.
Well, it almost sounds like there's this rewriting of the history, right? So I see kind of two lanes happening at once. That we have the evidence that we're starting to dig into that these ordinations happened, but then you have these canon lawyers and other folks that are saying like, well, those things may have happened, but they weren't legitimate because of these stipulations. But the big question that keeps coming into my mind is the modern Catholic Church, the Pope, they don't even recognize the conversation at all, it seems like. They don't want to discuss whether ordinations happened. They don't want to discuss, well, they did happen, but they weren't legitimate. It's almost like the conversation isn't on the table right now.
You are so right.
Yeah.
The issue of women's equality in the
Yeah.
church is not even on their radar. Centuries ago, I mean, it wasn't genius when you think of it.
Yeah.
After women were finally removed, and I just go back to this one point, they
Yeah.
were finally removed because they came up with a church law or canon law, they call it,
Yeah.
that women could no longer be up on the altar.
Mm.
So that really was like the final blow.
Yeah.
And that's eventually, that did it. And I thought, I mean, wasn't that underhanded?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, what were you just asking me?
Well, to me, it's such a large question, really, about why can't this even be discussed? Why can't this history be discussed? It's for instance, I'll give you an example. It's not like I've ever seen Pope Francis, the current pope, say, "Hey, I've seen these conversations about a hidden history. It's not true." Or I haven't seen him say, on the other hand, there were ordinations, but they're just not legitimate. They won't talk about it. And I think maybe a good segue to this, maybe this is a good way that we can kind of continue forward. There was a quote in your book. You said that the Pope warns about the quote unquote trap of feminism. These are his words. I really want to dig into feminism and the Catholic Church. And I'll give you just a quick anecdote. I don't know if you've ever seen The Sopranos. I don't know if you've ever,
Oh,
are you
yes.
familiar with the show? Yeah. So there's a scene in The Sopranos where Edie Falco's character Carmela is at the church and she's complaining about, I guess, equality in marriage, that she feels like she has to do so much and Tony and the men don't have to do a lot. And she goes, "I'm not a feminist and I'm not asking for 50-50, but I think she says like maybe 70-30." And I thought that was such an interesting kind of look into how feminism can kind of be a dirty word, and it might be, you'd have to tell me, is it a dirty word in Catholicism? What are your thoughts around this?
Well, we know that going back to the 1920s, where um, the women suffragettes, it was a political issue. It was voting,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it was just like they were considered out of their lane at that time.
Sure.
How dare you do that? And then um, in the Catholic Church, I don't know. I think the church is probably afraid because they know the truth of this issue, and they don't want women out there rocking the boat.
Yeah.
But it's ingenious in the way that they bring into so many discussions on women's ordination. They use the word feminism again like it's some type of an
Sure.
evil word, but what that does, that revs up their base in the
Yes.
sense that there are so many women out there, then just get, these other people, whatever they think.
Yeah.
And it takes, unfortunately, away from the issue at hand, the actual inequality.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's 5 biblical reasons why women can't become priests, and yet biblical research shows
Hmm.
they're not biblical at all.
Yeah.
It's all cultural
Yes.
bias.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea that like we are made in the image of God, well, why isn't the hierarchy adhering to what Jesus said back
Hmm.
in Genesis 1:27?
Yeah.
In the divine image, he created them, women and men. He made them.
Hmm.
They don't follow that. But what has happened is it was so really crafty on their part. Centuries ago, they came out with one statement.
Mm.
There never were women priests,
Oof.
period.
Wow.
So that kept the press off of their backs, and that the laity, like, you believe it.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be, well, of course, when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, um, the church of all establishments, this was a place where there was truth.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know the so-called truth. I mean,
Yeah.
but that's why I think people were quiet and they just they believed in it. But
Hmm.
they will never even broach that issue because, like you said, if like say Pope Francis said, "Well, I've seen something about this," or
You're
"I've
right.
seen," no, because then that would
Yeah.
sort of reopen, make like a discussion, or people then would start commenting on it, and they
Sure.
don't want that.
Yeah.
And I think really today it comes down to the point that obviously the hierarchy would have to come out
Hmm.
and say, we have lied to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, with the awful sexual abuse issue, droves of Catholics have left the church.
Yeah.
This would just be another.
Yeah.
So I think it's because they're afraid now. They would have to own up that they had lied
Yeah.
to all these women.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you make a really good point here that there's losing face, losing power. There's a lot at risk for the Catholic Church to say, we weren't honest to you before, or we didn't tell you the whole truth before, or we intentionally lied to you. That would cause probably a lot of chaos in the Catholic Church. I mean, can you tell me just your opinion, in let's say we could wave a magic wand and tomorrow Pope Francis says, yeah, this is actually all true. How do you think that would impact the Catholic Church?
Well, unfortunately, within the Catholic Church, there's like a division. There are very conservative Catholics,
Mm,
and of course, I'm a liberal Catholic,
yeah.
but I grew up with Vatican II,
Yeah.
and Pope John the 23rd convened this council, and he said
Hmm.
it's time we open the windows of the church up. It's time to see the signs of the times.
Oof.
And, that was really radical back then.
Sure.
But one of the big things that came out of Vatican II was the church, as we knew it, rather going to now it's a liturgy of the Eucharist. It used to be called the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
The priest, all you saw was his back.
Right. Yeah.
And then, of course, there were these changes where the priest was facing you. And then the people were able to answer, sort of
Yeah.
really include people into this.
Yeah.
And there never was a proper rollout, like, let's say, 101. What was no, seriously, what
Yeah.
was behind this?
Yeah.
And with that, the language as well
Yeah.
went from Latin to English.
Yeah.
Of course, I didn't know Latin, so I loved it. Now I can. Well, of course, in your missal, it would have like the Latin and the
Yeah.
English, but still, to me, it was more personal. And plus, I think the best thing is it said from biblical research, this is the closest mass that we are using today that the first Christians were using.
Interesting.
But unfortunately, for those individuals who are very conservative, they never really
Mm.
understood. And plus, I really blame it on the church. They didn't give that proper instruction why we're changing this.
Yeah.
And there are so many Catholics that are into the Latin Mass
Mm-hmm.
only.
Yeah.
And that came about in the 16th century of the church.
Mm.
And when Jesus was alive, there never would have been all that pomp and circumstance.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there just wouldn't.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Latin Mass, I'm not making fun
Mm-hmm.
of the Latin Mass, but that crucial understanding of why
Mm.
the main Mass today is not the Latin Mass, that it's this other Mass, is because they were trying to get it back to the closest way that the first Christians
Yeah.
celebrated the Mass. But we still have that awful division
Right.
today.
Yeah.
And then you bring up a person like myself.
Mm-hmm.
Who is this heretic? We know women were priests,
Right. Right.
let alone Mary, Mother of God,
Yeah. Yeah.
being a woman priest.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But when you get all these, how can I say it? You get all these different angles coming in.
Yeah.
Boy, Mother Mary of God would just be a wonderful role model.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
For any younger girl in the church.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, most Catholic women have never heard that she was the model for all priesthood
Yeah.
in the Catholic Church. All we know is Mary is the model for the perfect motherhood.
Right.
And again, I'm not making fun of that, but I'm just saying Mary has been put up on some type of a pedestal.
Mm-hmm.
And they even commented on most of the art shows Mary as having blue eyes and blonde hair. And yet she grew up over,
Right.
in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And these Catholics would God help us when they go to heaven. If they reach heaven, they'll be
This brown woman who was actually the first priest. There'd be a lot of surprises, I think.
yes. And I mean, it's just unreal. It's like, but it's sad because again, this has just been that's the art that was there. It's
Yeah.
always there. And then when you don't realize this history,
Yeah.
and I just think it's so sad instead of people getting excited
Yeah.
that Mary was like an everyday woman.
Mm.
She had to go out with her jugs of water.
Yeah.
She had to bring that water back. She had to prepare the meals.
Mm-hmm.
And she, as a woman priest, obviously was ministering to other women.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and if people could only understand, there's like two sides to Mary.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that you can have both sides, but I just, as a woman, why is it right And
Mm.
again, lying to me doesn't cut it.
Yeah.
We have all, as women, been duped.
Yeah.
And that's where it really cuts, because how do you ever begin
Mm.
to swallow that, let alone digest that fact that our religious heritage has been robbed from us?
Mm.
We have, through the generations on the male side, it used to be it was such an honor in the family. Like maybe one family, if it was an Irish family, one family, Sean would be a priest,
Mhm.
Ryan would be a bishop, or Liam would be a cardinal.
Yeah.
Okay, well, here's the woman. where, where are, where is that same religious heritage?
Yeah.
We have Mother Mary, but of course, back then we never knew she was a woman priest.
Yeah.
And then finally, around 69, the church finally came with it and corrected Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's just all these centuries, woman that actually received a call, it was
Yeah.
just awful. Because if
Yeah.
you were within our church, that call was going nowhere. And again, equating, like you said, feminism, again, the Pope, others in a discussion of women priests, well, it's these feminists,
Mhm. Mhm.
it's these women that are out just for power.
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah.
And what is a woman that receives a call from God?
Mhm. Mm.
Where does power come into that? I
Well, I
mean,
mean,
if
it
it's a
kind of makes it interesting that they would even talk about power, because is that how they see their position, as this power position and not this humble position of service to,
yes, that's a
humanity? And
Freudian slip. Yeah.
right, if they see it as like, oh, you're grabbing for power, or were you grabbing for power when you became ordained? I mean, so many big conversations here. I really appreciate your perspective on this, and I want to make sure, because we're getting kind of to the second half of this, I want to make sure we dive really deeply into Mother Mary being the first priest. That, and I know it's in the title of your book, but even as you started to reveal that, I was still shocked as I was reading it that not only was she a priest, she was the priest. She was a template. She was considered the model for priests going forward. And I would say, if you think about it logically, it does make sense that Mother Mary would be a priest, the priest.
Mhm.
But cultural understanding, even as me, I, like I said, I didn't grow up Catholic, but even in the Protestant church, I grew up Baptist. Even in just culturally, what we think about Mother Mary in the West, we just think of her as like the perfect mommy. She's the perfect mom. We don't
Yeah,
think of
she's up on
her
that pedestal.
right. So can I really would love to hear a little bit about the evidence around this, because I saw that there were some artwork where she was wearing what a priest would wear, like she was depicted as a priest.
Yes, and it's interesting in the artwork. She had a chasuble and stole, which are
Yeah.
like priestly vestments.
Yeah.
And back in 1903, Pope Leo the 13th was allowed to have like an actual picture of that,
Yeah.
of Mary in a priestly garb, to hang that picture in his office. And 1913, we can see changes are coming.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, that was no longer allowed. And then in 1926, they took Mary's title away from her. There
Mhm.
was going to be no longer any devotion to Mary Priest. And John Vinsgaard's mentioned, is this a coincidence? Because
Mm.
what's so specific or important in 1926?
Yeah.
And just the thought, I was thinking, my God, who are these men? I
Mm.
mean, wouldn't it be scary to be thinking you're erasing, you're taking away a title
Yeah.
from Jesus's mother, but they had no qualms about that.
Yeah.
So John Vinsgaard mentioned that it was that same year there were women from other church denominations that were starting to, as well, want to become woman priests.
Yeah.
And the only thing I can think of, they probably thought out of mind, out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
But this was awful. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
if you read my book. there was a little tiny article, and the Roman official was talking to the newspaper man, thanking him.
Mm.
It was so good the way you handled this question. And in other words, in so many words, and of course it would the regular person couldn't understand it. I
Yeah.
thought, "What?"
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're calling Mary Mother of God a question? You're referring to her like an object.
Right.
But what I also found fascinating was my mother and grandmother were both alive in 1926.
Mhm.
They never obviously had never heard of any of this,
Yeah.
let alone Mary being a priest,
Yeah.
but that her title had been taken away from her.
Yeah.
So that I find miraculous because again, I don't know if the newspaper people were paid off or
Right.
what, but none of this, like would make its way.
Yeah.
Because you think that would be, oh my God, that would be such newsworthy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting as we're having this conversation, and I'm seeing this pattern of, as we talked about, cover-ups, rewriting history, just hiding certain facts, lying or not telling full truths to the, parishioners and just the normal everyday Catholics. I'm trying to find a way to phrase this question without it being sensationalist, but I feel like if I deeply believed, in my core that, you know, all of this is true, that Jesus lived and he died for our sins, and I am going to become a priest, a male priest, and live out this calling, that I would want to be as honest and truthful to my God and my Savior as possible. Like, I don't understand how they can almost like live this double life of wanting to serve God and to, emulate Jesus, but then to also lie. Do you have any kind of understanding of how they could do this?
Well, this is awful to say, but just taking the example of the priest sexual abuse,
Yeah.
how these men could molest boys in the sanctuary, and then you come out and you say mass like
Yeah.
nothing happened, and again, who are these men that have no fear
Right. Right.
for God? So it's such a perverse, sickening, and I call it a culture because unfortunately it was the perfect culture for them to be in the sense that like going back into the 50s, 60s, they well the middle 70s it started to change when parishes had councils
Yeah.
that people started to question. But before that, everyone was silent, and you didn't have droves of people coming down into the rectory to,
Mm.
to ask questions. So
Yeah.
they could molest a child there, and
Yeah.
plus there was this trust that it was like an honor that. Well, we never had this happen, but you've
Mm.
heard the stories where parents would invite the priest for dinner
Yeah.
and he would stay over and then
Yeah.
he would molest the child.
Yes.
Um, it's just it's so repulsive.
Mm.
I really don't know how they do it, but it's like in a sense that they're leading two lives.
Yeah.
They come out and they do the mass, and what does the mass or the liturgy even mean to them?
Mhm. Mhm.
And yet they do that, and then they're free to go on and do. They are free because the bishop has the discretion
Yeah.
to decide if what they've done, raping a child, is that a sin
Mm.
or is it a crime?
Mm.
And we know where all the bishops are saying that it is a sin.
Yeah.
And just moving these priests like on a chessboard, here, there,
Mhm.
everywhere. And then it's basically, and this is awful, it's giving them a whole new uh, group of new victims to,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah. It's heartbreaking and it's unsettling. And when I talked to Father Ann, we talked about that juxtaposition as well, that, men of God who have this great responsibility, and the way that the church has decided to treat that, and, comparing that to this other subject of a hidden history and how they're just choosing to ignore it. In your book, there's an image that appears a few times, and it's like a little scroll, and it says, "Sign the petition for Pope Francis to reinstate Mary's title to Mary Priest back to her." Is that your ultimate goal? I feel like this is such a big crusade. Is that like the pinnacle for you?
Well, it's a very important point because, again, until young women have an actual role model in the church to aspire to, um, women
Mm-hmm.
now in their 30s, in fact, are the largest group of Catholics women that are leaving the church.
Yeah.
And right there, well, then where's your base of young Catholics in the future?
Yeah.
But they have just had it with the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And seeing a picture of Mary, Mother of God, in priestly attire would just, um, if the listeners could just think right now how you
Mm.
were probably shocked or still shocked.
Still.
Mary, a priest?
Yeah. Still. Yeah.
Well, why is that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is your church lying to you?
Yeah.
Why aren't they letting you become a woman priest?
Yeah.
Again, it gets back to this whole equality thing
Mm-hmm.
that these men, I think, I don't know if it's just that they're just so entrenched that in their power, um, they
Yeah.
don't want women anywhere around. And I don't know, this will probably shock a lot of the listeners too. 1976, of course, which in 2,000 years of church history,
Mm-hmm.
it's very recent.
Mm-hmm.
The Pope has his own commission. It's called the Pontifical Biblical Commission.
Mm-hmm.
And they looked in to the question of women being priests in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And the commission back then emphatically stated there is no biblical reason to prevent women from ordination.
Wow.
Well, hello,
Yeah.
what is going on?
Yeah.
There's a repeated pattern here.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus' own words being denied by the hierarchy.
Yeah.
In this case, the Pope's commission not moving forward, that there's no reason that women can't be priests.
Yeah.
And taking one of the commissions from Vatican II, councils rather,
Yeah.
Gaudium Spes, the Pastoral Constitution and the Church in the Modern World, in so many words it came out that they were going to eliminate all sorts of prejudice within the Catholic Church.
Mm.
And if they would have only acted on any of these,
Right. Right.
it's like they won't even listen to their own commissions.
Right. Right.
And why they can do this is because they have never been held accountable.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hoping from this book. It's like a grassroots effort.
Mm-hmm.
First, to get Catholics to realize this wonderful other side to the issue of women priests.
Yeah.
And get involved. And even if every Catholic, every man,
Mm-hmm.
people from other denominations,
Yeah.
send a postcard to Rome.
Yeah.
Why can't women be priests when the Pope's commission said there's no biblical reason? They're never held accountable.
Yeah.
So they never have to answer any
Yeah.
of this awful, as you said, you talk about the church uses the word scandal.
Yes. Yes.
Like even with the awful sexual abuse, well, of course, we couldn't bring that up because that would be a scandal.
Right.
Well, what did they call this centuries-old denial
Yeah.
of the truth?
Yeah.
They're the ones that are performing the scandal.
Yeah. Yeah. I first of all, I just have to commend you for your bravery to even be able to speak about this. And I want to point out something you said much earlier in this episode. You said, "Oh, I don't have, a PhD. I have a master's," and I think you said, pastoral counseling. And there was a quote in my head that I heard early on in the Baptist church. You'd hear this, but it might be universal that, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. I don't know if that's in Catholic circles as well, but
No, I've never heard that, but that's
yeah.
great.
And that popped in my head because, I think, and I'm clearly not a biblical scholar. It's been many, many years before I've really studied, many years since I've studied the Bible, but there's so many stories in the Bible about humble, simple, flawed people who were called by God to do great things. And I think your story, it's almost like you're like this David and Goliath story, that you're taking on the big bad corporate Catholic Church. And those are my words. I know those aren't your words. Those are my words. So please don't go after Margaret for that. But you're going after this big establishment, and you're trying to make this huge change. I guess my last question before we kind of talk about where people can find you: why try to change the Catholic Church? Why not try to build something new? Why do you see the need to have the Catholic Church admit this truth?
Because first of all, I mean, what is the premise of any church?
Yeah.
Hopefully they're truthful,
Yeah.
but in a sense, the Catholic Church that we have today is changing.
Yeah.
You look at the awful priest shortage,
Yeah.
and now you have to have these group of churches like a family. They incorporate them together.
Yeah.
I love the Catholic Church for all of its flaws. I've been a Catholic, but I'm just pointing out that things could be so much better.
Yeah.
You would have a stronger church
Mm-hmm.
because once and for all, you'd have equality of woman, and you would have women up there serving in the priesthood. And I'm sure, I know women could molest people. We're not, that could run in that circle too.
Mm-hmm.
But I cannot believe it would have ever reached
Mm-hmm.
the scale of what it is today
Sure.
if we would have had women that were priests.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
If you want to see a vibrant church
Mm-hmm.
that's not going to crumble,
Yeah.
you truly want to follow God's principles, and that's the whole thing. God's example,
Mm-hmm.
his principles, in a sense, have taken back seat
Mm-hmm.
because these men, for whatever reason, it's like, again, they're two people.
Yeah.
How they can say a mass or liturgy and do what they do,
Yeah.
and by them lying, the issue of women priests has become so contentious.
Yeah.
I was out at a gas station.
Mm-hmm.
I heard these two women talking, and the whole point was the woman reaped what she sowed because she was in the Catholic Church. She went on to become a woman priest. And I said to them, now, what would happen if either of you would receive a calling? It doesn't have to be a calling from God to be a priest, just some type of a calling. And were going to answer that call from God,
Mm-hmm.
and you were going through the particulars to, attain that.
Mm-hmm.
Where in that, how are you breaking law when you're following Jesus?
Yeah.
And there was just complete silence.
They were shocked. Yeah.
Because they don't come from that view.
Yeah.
They come from the point that it's cut and dry because that's all they know.
Yeah.
They never will step back even momentarily and hopefully, well, gee, what's motivating this woman? What's the necessity?
Yeah.
They won't listen to me because I don't have the Bible card,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. So until we can really get this word out there,
Yeah.
that women being priests are not breaking the law,
Yeah.
we're bringing back something that was within our church. And Pope Francis said we need a new theology. Well, let's bring back at least allowing women to do what they did centuries ago.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it's about bringing back the original theology is I think what I'm hearing. That's what it sounds like to me. So what's next for you, Margaret? Are you still on picket lines? Are you writing new books? What's next for you?
Well, I still do picket from time to time,
Yeah.
and I am going to write another book, but I haven't. Um, it's there, but it's hard to say. It's got to come together completely
Yeah.
in my mind.
Yeah.
So that'll be exciting.
Yeah.
And what was so different was I actually wrote another book, excuse me, Journey of a Celiac Soul, Soul,
Yeah.
A Second Chance at Life. And that was going to be my first book.
Yeah.
And I was into the middle of that book. And I've never had an experience like this.
Hmm.
I started to not hear voices, but get thoughts.
Yeah.
Woman priest,
Yeah.
woman's ordination.
Yeah.
And over a period of time, this became so incessant, I had to completely stop writing that book
Mhm.
and then move on to the book that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
So I really, in a sense, I do think there was some type of a presence there,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like God was calling you to write this book.
because then everything was just like I'd sit down and
Yeah.
and you have to realize I do not have a master's in journalism.
Yeah.
I had never written a book, let alone now two books. So
Yeah.
but I really hope with this book that it's going to open women up at least to realizing that there is another side to this issue,
Yeah.
and that what are you going to do to help hold the church accountable
Yeah.
and follow the synod. Um, as Father Ann, your
Yeah.
previous guest,
Yeah.
this is just unbelievable. I mean,
Yeah.
this is like a miracle in itself
Yeah.
that you would have the hierarchy reaching out to the everyday Catholic.
Mhm.
What are your concerns? What do you want changed?
Yeah.
And somewhere in there is the issue of woman priest.
Yeah.
And
Phenomenal.
yeah, be sure to follow Father Ann too
Yes.
at her website.
Yeah. Yes. Father Ann is a friend of the show, and I think I told you before I'm a huge fan of hers, and now I'm a huge fan of yours. I am like so in love with these women who are like taking on the Catholic Church. I think this is absolutely phenomenal, and it's when I started this show, I did not anticipate I would be revisiting, some of the things I learned about, Catholicism in college, but I am very, very happy that you both were so willing to kind of give me an education on this really important topic.
No, but I mean the service that you're doing, you're in a sense giving us a voice to, again, to spread that out.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate it.
Oh, Margaret, this has been phenomenal. Where can people find you if they want to learn more and if they care about this topic?
Yes, they can go over to yourradicaltruth.com, yourradicaltruth.com. I have blogs there, and I have my own podcast show, Your Radical Truth.
Wonderful. Margaret Mary O'Connor, your book, Scandal in the Shadows, The Original Priest, Mary Mother. It is a phenomenal read. I couldn't put it down. Again, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I wish you so much luck in this
Oh,
crusade.
thank you, Camille. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Highly Spiritual Person podcast. I really hope you found this conversation inspiring and uplifting. If you did, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more updates. And remember, sharing is caring, so if you think others would benefit from this content, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and family. We'll be back with more exciting content, so stay tuned and stay curious.